Hey friends, welcome to the Fat Man's revisitation of Middle-earth role-playing game system created by Iron Crown Enterprises back in the 80s. This is the installment called Sea Lords of Gondor, Pelargir and Lebennin. Lebanon. I never pronounce any of these things well, and I always have my own take on them, however you look at it. Anyway, this is actually more of a source book and less of an adventure module. And it is like a lot of them, they've carved out a piece of the pie and now are embellishing on it. They're taking up on it. The lion's share of the material in this is got to be fluff or speculation on the part of the writers and creators of Iron Crown at the time, because let's be truthful, very little this is it's mentioned briefly in the books and in the movies, and other than that, we really don't know a lot about it. We do know that Gondor is a country, and it's a very big country. It connects on one entire side is bordered by the ocean or the Great Bay of Belfalas at one point or another. And so, as a sea power and descendant from the Numerians, who are, they themselves are a massive sea power, it makes perfectly good sense that that Gondor, in this long established tradition, would continue to do the same. So, Pelargir is at the time of Lord of the Rings, probably or the largest city in Gondor at the time. Prior to that, when we're talking the play area, roughly 1640, Third Age, 1,000 years or so before the Ring, it is the third largest city, although it's quickly becoming the second because Osgiliath falls, and once the city is more or less abandoned, it starts to deteriorate. People start to immigrate out of it. Pelargir, its importance becomes even more so, especially when the crown has to move the fleet to Pelargir full time. So that's what this is basically a very big seaport, a la seafaring fortress for the Navy of Gondor. It sits in the middle of the Unadin River, the mouth of the Unadin, so it basically has access to both the ocean, the Bay of Belfalas, and the Great River. So it is a crucial strategic point. It has been contested for millennia from various foes, and in the early days defended by the Nemorians, and then later by Gondor. So in that aspect, Lebanon, the land of five rivers, is the heart of Gondor. It is probably the most well-populated, most civilized section of the country, and by all means, the provider of both the breadbasket of the main cities as well as the lion's share of its military forces are going to originate from people coming from these areas. Of course, we go past the regular, all the other stuff that you get your typical ice books, introduction, the overview, the history of Lebanon, and it goes literally they go way back to the late First Age and work your way forward in various steps. The War Last Alliance, the Define of Pelargir, the Sea Kings of Gondor, the Quiet Years, the Golden Age, the Kinstrife, the Schism. There's a huge amount of backstory in Middle-earth, and that's one of the things that made it attractive to me as a game system. That similar to what makes Game of Thrones so popular today, is on a sublime level. It's the sheer history that goes back. So much stuff has gone past in the backstory that it's myth and legend at at the point of the movies, of the TV show. So you can feel it in the air, and these people are just bit players in a very big moving tapestry. Land and the water, the borders, the mountain valleys, Bay of Belfalas, the climate, weather conditions, plants and animals, which is typical of these guys. You've got some pictures. Here's a sea dragon, as they call it. A big alligator, cheetah, swamp dragon. Sorry. The inhabitants, talk about the elves, the Dunedain, the government, the alliances and conflicts. Then we get to Pelargir. A big portion of this book is Pelargir itself. It's a big city and a big fortress, so it shows the overview, the city plan, key local sites. Here is a small map of Pelargir. I actually have a color map up here in the cabinet up here someplace. I waved it around a while back in another blog, and it folds, it folds out to be pretty good size. The lesser towns in the region, I like these sort of things because, like I said, as a lazy GM, it just gives me a whole slew of ready-made material for small towns and villages. In this case, a fairly large city on the coast or on a big river. So all I got to do is change a few names and make it my own, make it fit into my campaign, and I don't have to go to huge, great detail creating it, which in a lot of cases, come on, your players, they have a tendency to not take the path you lay out for them. They want the less beaten path. And then when you try to prepare for that, then they suddenly become conservative and they don't want to go that way. What do? You either learn to gently guide them in the direction that you want them to go, or you tear your hair out, start going bald, and become a nut job and start ranting and raving on things like YouTube. Huh? Hey, wait a minute. You trying to... Never mind. Yeah, it is what it is, my friends. It is what it is, right? And we got into Tolfalis. Tolfalis is a royal march, basically an island out in the Bay of Belfalas, very rugged and unappealing, very lightly populated, with some distant upland valleys and some weird places that only in these guys' creation. And we get to chapter 14. This here is a very good chapter, and I've used this material in other game systems, in Dungeons and Dragons, because they, for some reason, and I'm going to admit that I have everything they ever produced, and that's not true. I have never had that kind of deep pockets. I've tried to have as much of it as I could, but I couldn't afford to buy everything that ever came out for Dungeons and Dragons. Pretty much, because they came out in installments and I bought them as they came. And then the latter years or two, they came out with some stuff and I drifted off because I was buying other things. It was just a matter of money. But I had the lion's bulk share of this particular version, and that was all that mattered to me. This chapter is called Ships and Seafaring, otherwise Gondorian Seacraft. What I liked about it, aside from the historical information and the backstory stuff that it gives you so you understand just how much of a ocean-going power Gondor really is at any point in its history, because you don't see that. You barely vaguely scratch the surface of that in the book or in the movies. We know that Aragorn claimed he'd spent some time at sea with the Gondorian Navy, he'd spent time in the Gondorian army without anybody knowing who he was. We get a brief hit on the Umbers, the Corsairs of Umbar, but we don't know the depth of the history of them until you really start digging. The Haradan, we see their forces, the Southrons, the Easterlings, in the battles of Minas Tirith, but we don't see a very brief picture of the black ships, but we don't know much about them. Well, this goes into much greater detail on that, but what it also does, from a perspective of a Middle Ages, pre-Middle Ages time period, which a lot of our hack and slash is more Middle Age era, in my opinion. Sword and sorcery is pre-Middle Age period, more like the early years of the late BC versus the early AD. The Roman era, the Greek era versus, Conan the Barbarian versus Game of Thrones, which is obviously set in the middle of their version of the Middle Ages, which is much more advanced, much more civilized in some aspects, and much more culturally developed as a civilization, where not so much in the earlier years. There's a lot more bend. But what we got here is a whole slew of NPC ships of various types and sizes with their stats, right? And more importantly, a set of rules for naval warfare, for naval combat, that is fairly in-depth. It isn't just a couple little paragraphs in the back of the GM guide that says, this is what you might want to do. This goes into much greater detail, and it allows you to deal with things like turning in battle, combat, ramming, rowing, shearing, grappling, wind diagrams, sailing, movement versus, rigged ships versus road ships, and so on and so forth. You see that? Look at that. See? This is more reminiscent of a tabletop war game, a naval war game. And if and I've used those. I've got one or two supplements for a couple of my wartop games that allow for naval combat, and I've used those in seagoing adventures when I've had campaigns that have involved a lot of people sailing boats or being involved in that. And typically speaking, and I'll try not to wrap this up so it doesn't run long like I did on the Shield's Lair thing. Typically speaking, when we do a sea campaign, a naval campaign, the PCs are a core squad or group of specialists, if you will, on a ship with a much larger crew. Traditionally speaking, they're not, the entire ship's crew. And so you have a slew of basically second tier NPCs who serve important roles, but they shouldn't be the basic red shirts of Star Trek. They shouldn't just be the ones who stop the arrows so the heroes can be heroic. If you use them in that aspect, then okay, so be it. But I don't think that's an appropriate use for them. I've either broke it down in two ways. I either had the player characters be, like I said, a core squad of specialists who answer to a ship's captain and officers and are part of a larger crew, but act separately in a given situation. Or I've had them be the captain and senior officers of the ship's crew in the prospect that they are fighting the ship and fighting the commanding squads of sailors. If you go from that perspective, we've now changed over from the RPG mindset of one-on-one combat to a neo war game where we are in squad-based combat, which is a slightly different set of rules because have you ever, and if you have, my hat's off to you because I've tried it, where you've tried to control 25 or 30 NPCs in a given situation. When we're talking a large combat situation, we usually focus on individual battles because it's just a pain in the backside to try to have 25 or 30 sheets laid out across the table. I mean, it's just not practical in my perspective. On the other hand, if you clump them into squads, now we've got 5 sheets of NPCs representing 25 NPCs. This group is doing this. This group is doing this. We've changed it slightly so the NPCs are either in charge of a small squad of people or acting as a squad unto themselves in a squad level combat. So it is doable, it is plausible, but it is also difficult if you don't have a little bit of wargaming, the tabletop wargaming experience, I think, in my opinion. It's just my opinion. You may think otherwise. But anyway, Sea Lords of Gondor, great source book. Love it, hate it, blog it, click it, tell everybody, got to see this stuff.